Welcome to Leadership Where It Matters Most. The family is the most important institution in the world. The future of the church passes through the family. The church has the greatest mission of any organization ever. Go and make disciples of all nations. The family and the church. This is where leadership matters most. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into Leadership Where It Matters Most. Today's guest is Dr. Julia Sadusky. Dr. Julia is an author, she's a speaker, she's a licensed psychologist. She serves as ministry educator. She offers trainings and consultations to counseling centers, to faith-based institutions on sexuality, on gender identity, mental health, trauma-informed care. She speaks a lot, and her real passion is on the intersection of sexuality, gender, theology, spirituality. And she's just a real gift to the church. She is speaking into an area that is very politically charged and can lead to some, unwanted experiences, if you will, because it's a tough area to speak into. So today's conversation, Dr. Julia and I kind of meander all over the place. We certainly begin with a little bit of her testimony and her upbringing and kind of her intellectual pursuit and her academic work, and how that led to a doctoral dissertation that focused on the experience of loneliness in Christian sexual minorities that were kind of navigating this permanent singleness. And she talked a little bit about that and how that kind of fueled her entry into the other areas that she's into now. We speak a little bit about one of her books called Start Talking to Your Kids About Sex, which is just a great gift to parents, primarily because it provides a real robust, comprehensive, principle-based, but also concrete and practical tips on navigating conversations with your children and raising your children up. And one of the reasons why I appreciate this book is that it's not just about the sex talk. In my ministry to men, there's a lot of anxiety around the sex talk because so much is wrapped up in one conversation. But this book encourages, rightly so, that it's not one conversation. It's age appropriate from the beginning, ongoing conversations that are beyond just the birds and the bees, beyond just the sex talk. Yeah, wonderful wisdom from there. I can't get too much into it. I'll speak too long about it. So Dr. Julia and I talk about her book, talk about gender dysphoria and sort of what the church is doing well in this regard and supporting individuals as well as families that are directly impacted by that experience. And broader out into just psychology in general and its place in church and spiritual lives and all that. So wonderful conversation. Dr. Julia is a great gift. Deeply appreciate her work and her perseverance in it. So enjoy this conversation. Dr. Julia Sadusky, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
It's so good to be with you, Brett.
I would say thank you for being on the podcast again, because through no fault of your own, it was all on me. The episode recording was not very good the first time we did it. So you're so gracious to record a second time. So thank you very much.
Yes, thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. So Dr. Julia, I'm sure some of the listeners are already familiar with you, your books, either live presentations or things they see on YouTube. But for those who aren't as familiar with Dr. Julia Sadusky as they should be, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your story? Tell us a little bit about your journey, your faith, your family, academic background, all of it.
Okay. Well, I'm currently a licensed psychologist in Colorado. I grew up on the East Coast of the United States, so in Delaware, which most people, when I say that, they say, I've never met anybody from Delaware. So if that's a listener, you're in good company. I was raised in a Catholic family. I'm one of 7 kids, the second oldest of 7. And I have to be honest that from a very young age, I really had a pretty deep connection to God. I don't really remember a time where I didn't feel the presence of Christ or know him or care about that. I was kind of the kid who was trying to evangelize with a 3-leaf clover to my friends, teaching them the Trinity at a young age. So my faith was always really important to me. And then I also became really interested in psychology probably in my teen years. So I had people who I cared about who experienced mental illness. And I really felt drawn to trying to learn as much as I could about the human person to be able to show up in spaces around mental health. And so that was the start, maybe, of my interest in psychology. I went to Ave Maria University for undergrad in South Florida, and that was where I studied psychology and theology and really took to theology of the body. So I studied there under Mikhail Waldstein, who translated theology of the body into English. And what a gift to learn from somebody like that. And
Wow.
he really kind of captured my attention, I would say, in the realm of sexuality. And so I also had people in my life at that time who were sharing about same sex sexuality. So people who were experiencing attraction to people of the same sex, and they were coming to me, and some of them were wondering, will I go to hell by virtue of these experiences of attraction? Questions like
Mm,
that, that I just frankly had never had to ask myself. And so I think that started my curiosity about the space of human sexuality because it was relevant to people I loved. And then I studied under Mark Yarhouse at Regent University. That was where I did my doctoral training. And I went there because he was really on the front lines of integrating faith and sexuality and gender at a time in our culture where gender was really rising to a place of significance. So that was where kind of I started to meet with families who were navigating questions around gender identity. And that really started my research and my studying in sexual and gender identity development more broadly. And here I am now working in private practice. I've worked in eating disorders. I've worked with survivors of complex trauma. That's a lot of my caseload. And then, of course, people with LGBT experiences, as well as people, again, with trauma histories, which has really informed some of my latest writing for Catholic audiences.
yeah. And we're going to get into some of the writing, the books that you've written, and probably some of the YouTube things. I didn't ask this before, but it's interesting. You mentioned theology of the body and how important that was as kind of a segue into these other areas. Do you think that we have extracted all that we can from John Paul II's beautiful deposit of theology of the body, or is there's so much more left?
My experience of reading it is that there must be more left. I mean, I think something that has come together just, since he gave those audiences and those talks in the 70s and the 80s. I mean, that I don't think we could possibly scratch the surface. I do think there have been some Catholic thinkers and writers and popular speakers who have given us a lot of theology of the body. I don't know that we've been able to extract everything we could from that. And I think we probably will for decades and decades because there's such a richness there. And so much of it applies, right, to broader questions of what is man, what is a person, and what are we here for? What is our vocation more broadly? And so I
Mm,
think there's probably a lot more to understand there, as well as integrating that with other things. I think sometimes we feel as if theology of the body is the answer for all questions around human
right.
sexuality. But I do think there's a large deposit in our faith tradition around sexuality that goes beyond that, even, and is really helpful.
Yeah. This might be a good springboard. I kind of warned you maybe we talk about this. So let's talk about, like you mentioned the term integration of all these disciplines or truths. And this is one thing I so love and appreciate about the church is that the church is always discerning that which is true and not afraid to say that's true. So not afraid to go to natural sciences or social sciences or even economics or, it's always in the search of truth. And there are, I would think, some people that are maybe nervous or can't find the integration between spirituality and psychology. And it's really unfortunate because there are graces available to us through a deeper understanding of human psychology. Do you see that? People are maybe hesitant to adopt the truths from the social sciences. And where does that come from? How do we handle that? How have you encountered that?
Yes, it's such a great question. And I think if we're honest in our circles, there certainly can be a hesitancy around psychology in a particular way, maybe even more than medicine and even other social sciences, certainly economics being one of them. That psychology on the whole has been developed by people who are non-theistic and
Mm,
non-Christian. And so each of the theories that we might draw from in treatment are going to be incomplete in and of themselves. And I think that has something to do with the hesitancy. I think also people like Freud, who have really shaped psychology, even if many psychologists and mental health providers wouldn't draw from Freud at all today, there has been this sense that Freud had a tendency to pathologize spirituality and religion and see it as functioning for people in a way that was actually not helpful in many cases. And so, of course, that was informed by his own story and his own history. But I think people can feel hesitant because of that. Psychology also literally means the study of the soul, right? And so
Right.
some people say, well, is that just trying to substitute itself for spiritual directors or confessors? Or is it navel gazing? Is it leading people to a kind of self focus in an individualistic Western society where it actually doesn't serve us in
Mm.
branching out and loving people with radical charity? So yes, to your question, all of those factors I think converge in a way that makes people really hesitant of psychology, and there are no shortage of psychologists and mental health providers who are not people of faith, and that too can be a barrier. Feeling like, will I be understood by this person as we're entering into the depths of my heart and my soul?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a pedestrian example, but it's one that is quite insightful if we allow it to be. But if two people, one a theist, one a non-theist, look at a clock and it says 6 a.m., they're both right when they say it's 6 a.m.
Yeah,
And,
that's right.
we have to have that. I think that's magnanimity. It's just being open-minded, open-hearted to that which is true. So anyways, I don't see the conflict, but I can understand it, I guess. Anyway, so Dr. Julia, your doctoral dissertation focused on the experience of loneliness in Christian sexual minorities navigating permanent singleness. Wow, that's a big topic.
Yes.
Just share with listeners a little bit of the insight that you got from that experience.
Yes. Well, that research was really the start of a line of research. When I looked out at the literature in psychology around celibacy, around singleness, around loneliness in those experiences, I saw that there was really nothing available to people except for applications pulled from a line of research around Catholic priests. And so it struck me at the time that there really isn't any mapping of sustainable pathways for people pursuing permanent singleness, especially people who are not in a kind of consecrated life or priestly vocation. And what I was struck by when I would meet with clients who were experiencing attraction to the same sex, especially teenagers, was they felt as if it was a death sentence to commit to singleness for the long haul. And I was so struck by that as a single woman in graduate school that felt like a death sentence. And yet, as I looked around in our communities, I didn't see many models of permanent singleness that were thriving models. And I think our communities are so wired towards encouraging marriage and encouraging priestly vocations and religious life that there really wasn't a sense of stability for people in that space. And so that was a little bit of kind of the background, I suppose, of that line. But what I learned from that research, number one, was, many people felt really convicted to move towards singleness, and they had very few resources to move in that direction, meaning they might have had people in their life who supported them in that and said, yes, I'm glad for you that you're going to, abide by a conservative sexual ethic or a traditional sexual ethic or a biblical understanding. And yet there was not a scaffolding or a support around people in the practicals of daily life, which often led to loneliness. So, a good example that someone offered me was I'm in my 50s and I need a new fridge. And I don't know really who to call on a Saturday when that's getting delivered. Who's in my corner who I can count on to drop everything and come over and help me move this fridge? I can't do it alone. Or questions about the future, right? As I age and as I get older, who will visit me in the hospital? Will I die alone? Financial barriers, right? Even questions of, can I go on vacation? Who can I go on vacation with? And where do I belong? Who are my people who, if I didn't show up at church on Sunday, they would notice They would notice I'm
Mm.
gone. And so all of these pieces, even more actually for most people than kind of the experience of a lack of sexual activity itself, it was that broader scaffolding of community, being known, being seen, being loved, and in the particularities of the challenges that come up with loneliness in celibacy tied to sexual attraction to the same sex, right?
Mm.
That was a real challenge. Now, I'll say to you, Brett, that the people who were doing best were people who really did experience being known and loved in pockets of safety. So they didn't need everybody in their community to appreciate the intersection of faith and sexuality and other aspects of their experience, but they did need some people, people in a small group, people in their faith community who said, we're going to do life with you. We're going to invite you over for dinner spontaneously, and we're not going to clean up the house before you come. Or can you host us because I really don't want to cook tonight? So that mutuality,
Mm.
that reciprocity, and we see this in theology of the body, right? That idea of self gift.
Mhm.
People will say, I can survive without sex. I cannot survive without intimacy. That experience of being known and seen and loved and received and receiving others as well.
Yeah. Is there a technical definition of loneliness? Like, is there a metric on it? How does that work?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say we're early in measuring loneliness. Certainly, there are measures. My line of research was qualitative, not quantitative. So I wasn't measuring the experience of loneliness in any type of
Mhm.
robust psychometric way, but just simply asking people what were the indicators of loneliness for them. Now, I will say loneliness is a universal experience. We all experience its emotion like anger, rage, sadness, fear, or all other emotions. Loneliness is an emotional experience tied to a loss of connection with yourself,
Mm.
with others, and we could add with God. So sometimes we think of loneliness as I'm alone, but actually from the research we've learned that you can be alone and be experiencing solitude, which is that restful state of being in a room and in a space alone. You can be lonely in a room full of people where you don't feel seen and supported and accepted and a sense of belonging. The best way to think about loneliness, though, is that it's a check engine light. It's our body's way of
Mm.
communicating you're needing more connection to yourself and maybe others than you realize right now. The challenge, though, with loneliness is usually it comes with judgment for many of us today. We feel as if I'm lonely because I'm doing something wrong. I'm
Mm.
problematic or I'm flawed in some way. That's why I'm lonely. So, again, the people who experience loneliness in the most safe way, the most sustainable way, are when we can reduce those judgments, when we can admit the loneliness to others to reduce the shame around loneliness, bring other people in, bring God in, connect to ourselves, even if we can't see somebody in that moment. There's a lot of ways
Yeah.
to cope with loneliness that are better than the rumination, the spiraling,
Mm.
and the kind of attributions of myself as flawed.
Yeah. You mentioned the word shame. I was going to ask you what the role of shame was with people's experience because, yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Yes, definitely people, both in the research and then, of course, in a clinical practice, all the time talk about how usually we have kind of primary and secondary emotions, which is we have emotions that are present kind of automatically, and then we have secondary emotions that almost you could think of it as heaping on top of that
Yeah.
initial raw emotion. And so if you have an experience of loneliness, and you have the sense that loneliness, again, is tied to deficiency in me, a lack of measuring up to the standards or expectations of my community. I'm lonely because I'm single and I can't get married because I'm sexual minority and I am a sexual minority because fill in the blank, whatever ways I make meaning out of that. Well, there's all these layers of shame, and shame is I am bad or defective in some way by virtue of this experience. And so I will hold other people at arm's length. Now, think about that in terms of loneliness. If I'm going to hold people
Mm.
at arm's length because I'm afraid of them rejecting me, and so I will reject myself, that's where we see some of the most toxic states of loneliness. Because a loneliness that is more acute is not problematic. That kind of raw sense that I feel alienated, I feel
Mm.
disconnected, is not itself a problem. As I said, that's actually a good thing, a check engine light to move you towards community and connection. But this chronic loneliness, loneliness that says, I am helpless, I'm powerless to change my circumstances because I am the flawed thing.
Mm.
That, which so often can already be present in Christians experiencing same-sex attraction, just adds so many other layers. So it's not as simple as, why don't you call somebody when you're lonely? Why don't you?
Mm.
No, there's this heaping on of shame that really clouds our ability to resource support, to think clearly, to problem solve, and to remember that it's not our fault when we experience any number of human emotions. We do get to discern how we respond, but shame can so often paralyze us in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know what you think of this, but to put it bluntly, I think shame is one of the things that is most strongly from the pit of hell, if I can say it that
Yeah,
way.
that's right.
And that's not to say that, like, if I do something that is objectively wrong, sinful, call it whatever you want, there's a goodness to guilt that leads you towards repentance and, whatever, all those things.
Right.
But this idea of shame, where your identity is one of flawed or deficient or bad,
Yes.
and in a certain sense, there's nothing you can do because I'm slow on this. So you're going to be like, of course, that's obvious. But it's like that very mentality is what keeps you from the intimacy that will bring you life and relationship, because you
Yes.
feel that you can't be yourself, because then people won't accept you. So I just think it's this spiraling thing. And shame is from the pit. There is nothing good that comes from it. And religious communities are like known for mastering in, maybe not intentionally or even by action or word, but there's just something within the culture sometimes that can lead to shaming, and it's horrible.
That's right. It can be kind of clouded as a sense of humility, or kind of, self-sacrifice, self-abasement, kind of seeing myself as small, because shame makes us feel very small and insignificant. And Kurt Thompson wrote a book, The Soul of Shame, if listeners want to learn more about
Hmm.
that. But he speaks to what you're saying about the way in which shame is so used by the devil to really keep us alienated from God and others. And you see this after the fall, and I've spoken on my YouTube channel about this idea of shame, and on my Patreon about just the function of shame after the fall. Now, some people may be familiar with theology of the body, and they may say, well, what about in theology of the body, where there's this idea that shame is actually there to protect us in some way from being used? And I do think there's probably a space for recognizing that after the fall, shame reminds us to cover and hide from people or situations where we might be objectified. So this is why after trauma and harm, people in part feel shame. It's again a check engine light that I've been harmed, I've been violated, I've been used. And so if there is a positive function to shame, it's that. But that not brought into the light becomes so
Hmm.
toxic and so poisonous, and it does not stay stagnant. It festers and it grows, to your point, right? To the point where we can't access the
Hmm.
people and the spaces that can receive us there and actually reduce the shame.
Absolutely. But isn't shame in the positive light, the way we should understand that, isn't that just another way to describe modesty? Isn't modesty that which keeps hidden what should be hidden? It's appropriate to be hidden.
Yeah, I think you're right that modesty is the place where we keep hidden what is meant to be hidden because it's sacred, right? The shame emotional response, though, I guess would be this response when I'm being exposed in a way that will harm my dignity. Shame is that kind of emotional response to that. So modesty is how we maybe proactively buffer against that, and then shame is just that felt experience after the fall. You see it in Eden with Adam and Eve, the desire to hide, to cover up
Hmm.
in that place. Now, after the fall, shame very quickly enters and becomes toxic, where it moves us away from God and one another. And so, to your point, I think that's where it's after the fall very hard to stay in that place of the positive function of shame without relationship.
Yeah. Okay, let's move into some of the writing, Dr. Julia, if we could. So the first thing is, to the books, start talking to your kids about sex and talking with your teens about sex. So people with a perceptive eye will notice it's to your children and with your kids. So what's the intention behind that?
Yes. So that came up right as we were writing that 2-book series. I was talking with my editors, and they really wanted to reflect to parents that with younger children, we are offering them a framework and they can really receive, and they need us to be their teacher. They need the framework to be directive and clear and concise and specific. And so when we're teaching young children about human sexuality, we do take on a bit more of a lecture mode, but a simplistic understanding. And we're kind of delivering that. I'm giving this to you as a gift. Here's a sense of how you can approach your body, boundaries, relationships in that young age range. Now, anybody who's been around teenager, anybody who has teenagers, anybody who has been a teenager knows that as we move developmentally into that next stage, we're really trying to differentiate. We're trying to bump up against reality, test it, take it in, spit some of it out. I mean, really wrestling with teachings. And so the best approach with youth is not lecture mode. It's actually conversation, it's dialogue, it's modeling critical thinking with somebody. And so the image I have with teens and offer in the book is you're kind of sitting on a bench next to the teen and you're reflecting on reality together. So that's the reason for that type of nuance there.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes a lot of sense. So let's just talk about parents for a few minutes, because I know from my own personal experience, as well as, being in good community with other individuals as parents, there's a lot of anxiety within parents in navigating conversations about sexuality, and by extension around gender and, different expressions of sexuality and all the rest of it. So just talking about parents, where is that anxiety coming from? What can we do to support parents in this very, very important endeavor of talking with their kids in age appropriate ways their entire lives about sexuality? But first, the anxiety. Is that something you've experienced? Are parents definitely anxious about it?
Yes, right. Anxiety can sound and look a lot of different ways, but I think the root feeling for many parents is fear and anxiety. Fear being there's an actual threat, something bad's going to happen, and anxiety, the unknown possibilities
Mm,
of what could go awry if we try to have these conversations with children and teens. Most parents today concede that having conversations in developmentally appropriate ways is a good idea with your kids and teens. So, that, in my experience as a clinician, as a speaker, is not entirely controversial. Everybody kind of gets that. But what I started to notice, Brett, time and time again from coaching parents was we would have the plan and then they would leave the session and they would go home and they'd come back the next week and no conversation happened. And it
yep.
became
Mhm.
evident, right, that there were barriers getting in the way. Maybe it's lack of modeling. So think about if you tried to drive a car without any driver's education and without ever seeing a person drive a car. Well, you would
Yeah.
really have a hard time. And so that lack of modeling creates a very intense anxiety about the unknown. Many parents felt overexposed in their own journey of sexuality. Maybe they came
Mm,
across pornography. Maybe they had a sibling that told them too much too soon. Maybe their parents were a little loose lipped about their own sexual lives, and that was unhelpful and really harmful. And so all of those things can shape parents where they say, I don't want to do that to my kids, and then can put it off for so long. Trauma can be another thing, obviously, that can come up for parents that can lead to a fear response at anything that hints at that range of sexuality conversations. And then we've talked about shame, but shame is an emotion that can be tied to fear, certainly, but distinct from it, that can also come up for parents and make them really hesitant to have these conversations. And by the time then a teenager is, developing and is moving through puberty, parents are usually the last ones to get to have these conversations. And that's why I wrote these books, is I really want
yeah.
parents to be a resource for their kids and teens in this space.
Yeah. And I so appreciate how they're written, Dr. Julia, because like when I talk particularly with men, ministry to men and all that, a lot of dads, really good-hearted dads, they are motivated to have the quote unquote sex talk with
Mhm.
typically there's sometimes they have that conversation with their sons, sometimes, the moms will have a conversation with their daughters. And so much seems to be riding on that one singular conversation, which of course, that increases anxiety because what if this one conversation doesn't go right? I've screwed up the whole thing and their
Yes.
future and all the rest of it. But one of the things I appreciate about your book is that it's not just about a sex talk, it's about age appropriate sexuality from the very beginning. So even when you have a chapter on, should I quote unquote force my children to hug a stranger, or you have conversations around saying no, and it's not just saying no in a sexual context, it's saying no because you have a preference and you don't want to violate the preference. So it's a much broader conversation, which I think is so helpful because it reduces the anxiety of putting too much into one conversation, and it opens our eyes to realize you can talk a lot about these things, which makes all the conversations easier. So I'm sure that was intentional, but it's just such a comprehensive, well-rounded, anxiety-reducing approach and wisdom that you've given.
Good. Yes. I think, the truth of it is, how do we approach something scary? Well, we gradually do it. We gradually approach the thing that is hardest, and we do so in incremental ways. And so, all through that first book is really just helping parents with their own fear and anxiety and building their confidence, saying, oh, okay, maybe I'd say it a little bit differently, but I can picture myself saying that to my kid. And that
Yeah.
conversation that comes about sexual intercourse at puberty, I don't have to do that yet, but I can do this. I can talk with them in medical terms about their genitalia to teach them about their body parts like I would any other body part with my kids. I can teach them, as you said, about boundaries and about touch and about preferences and saying no, and these things that feel so incremental that many of us miss, that totally impact sexual development moving forward.
Absolutely. One of the pains I have seen, again, I'm speaking with men who are, dads really want to do the right thing. You cannot deny the negative impact of our pornified culture because a lot of men struggling with pornography, they can't rise above the dirtiness of sexuality. There's just this implicit difficulty. And so to bring it into the light with the innocence of their child, like it's a very, I don't know what the word is, but they're not comfortable in talking about it because it has been such an experience of shame and guilt and maybe addiction and all the rest of it. Can you say something about that? Is that a reality, a negative impact for pornified culture?
Absolutely. And this is where parents are really hesitant to overexpose. So they don't want to talk about pornography with an 8-year-old and a 9-year-old, even though we know that kids are being exposed that early. And so and parents forget, right, that pornography exposure doesn't just happen through the internet on a cell phone. And parents might say, well, my child doesn't have a smartphone. And so they're protected, or their cousins, we know all their cousins and they also don't. But at school, in passing, at a play date, older siblings, there's lots of ways that kids can be exposed. And that first exposure is almost always accidental.
Mm,
This is why it's so key to set the framework for it with kids, is they're being exposed long before they're going to tell you. And by about age 15 for boys in particular, we're seeing about 100%, almost 100% of boys are exposed to pornography, about 1 in 4 girls by that age. And so it's not about if, it's about when. Now, there's
yeah.
still questions about how do we frame that and how do we not overexpose them in our details about what it is, what they would see. And the book gets into all the nitty gritty about that. But certainly for dads, they're hesitant to go there. Many dads have their own experience and exposure to pornography. Many experience shame about that. They don't realize that they didn't have a shot at age 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 to discern it. It happens to you,
Yeah.
and that shapes their own shame and makes them hesitant, I think, to guide their teen boys through this, and teen girls as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get into something even more sensitive and perhaps difficult to talk about: gender dysphoria. A lot of people are facing different situations that maybe they didn't want to and they don't know what to do. But let's just start with technically, what is gender dysphoria? Has the psychological community understood it in the same way? Is it evolving a little bit? What can you say about that?
Yes. So gender dysphoria is a mental health diagnosis. So think depression, anxiety. Gender dysphoria is the technical term in the psychological community for a person's experience of distress around embodiment. So the person experiences their body as at odds with or in conflict with their sense of self. So the person they see when they look in the mirror does not match what they would expect to see. Okay. So that's maybe the simplest way of defining gender dysphoria is an incongruence or a conflict between my embodiment and my sense of self as a person and a gendered person in particular. And so gender dysphoria used to be called in the diagnostic manual gender identity disorder. So in the psychological community, it actually used to be thought as an identity problem. The conflict itself was a sign of an identity problem that needed to be addressed therapeutically and in some rare cases medically. And so that's the older understanding. And now that has shifted to a kind of distress problem, that the conflict itself is in the psychological community framed not as a problem, but it's the distress about it when present that is a mental health concern. So now that is a pretty radical shift in framework. And increasingly, the psychological community is moving even to depathologize that further and say, well, no, you can be a transgender person or a non binary person, have no gender distress. And if there is distress, it's more tied to social rejection. And so that's where you see some of the political shifts happening and trying to kind of shape the way we understand gender more broadly and deconstruct even norms of sex and gender. So all of that is happening while people of faith,
Mhm.
Catholics with these experiences are trying to live their lives on a daily basis and navigate the pain and distress of being embodied, of being a human body everywhere we
Mhm.
go.
Absolutely. Because this is evolving so quickly, it so seems so politically charged and different things. What are we doing right as church? And what do we need to consider evolving so that we can, first of all, just have sane conversations about these things? Secondly, support individuals and their families. What are we doing right? And what do we need to maybe look at evolving?
Great question. I think in the last, let's say, 10 years or so, we were really helped in the church by the writings of Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium. I think his
Mm,
framework of an art of accompaniment has been a real gift to the church in this space. Not just recognizing the need to go to the margins, but what I love about what he says in The Joy of the Gospel is that we actually need to be initiated into the art of accompaniment. So we need to be
mm,
taught by the Holy Spirit how to remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other. So that
mm,
kind of instills in me a humility that I'm not good at this naturally, that seeing people with the dignity that they are due is not automatic as a human being, especially when there's difference, especially when there's political unrest and conflict, that I'm going to be actually primed to reduce the dignity of the other, not see them in all of their goodness and worthiness of respect and love. And so I do think the focus on accompaniment has been a help. It's become a bit
mm,
of a buzzword that can, anything true can become that. But I think that's been really useful. I think a
mm.
framework of synodality has been very helpful as well, listening to people. So many of us say, well, I'm good at listening. That's not the problem. When do I teach people? And it's been my
Yeah,
experience that we're actually not good at listening as human beings, especially when we're anxious or overwhelmed or disgusted or angry.
yeah.
And so I think that framework has been helpful as well. And then finally, I do think in recent years in the church, there's been a move towards trying to establish a level of clarity about complex topics. So, Dignitas Infinita was one effort in this regard that still offers a bit of nuance in the gender realm that may surprise people. But I
Mm,
think there's a helpfulness in that. What are we doing poorly? Well, I do think because frameworks of cultural diversity, kind of a broader secular narrative of diversity has been so saturating in our culture. I think many Catholics bristle at that and reject the
mm,
cultural secular diversity mindset. And in doing so, become really bristled at the thought of reaching out to the margins. And that to me is really problematic, because then we have our own experience of a person with these experiences and difficulties as if they're the political threat. They're the political ideology, their gender ideology or gender theory that Pope Francis called, demonic, like that they're that threat. And so then all of the emotions I would have about a threat to me, to my faith, to my historic understanding of the person, all of that comes out sideways on the person I'm called to accompany or simply greet in the grocery store, right? So that's one
Yeah.
thing I think we're doing poorly, or maybe struggling with in this regard. The political has really shaped us, especially in the Western world. And I think especially, in the United States and perhaps in Canada as well, that when I went and traveled in Europe last year and spoke in the UK to Catholic clergy, they said, oh, we don't have the political angst around gender here that you have there. It doesn't mean we don't
Mm.
care about gender. It's just there's not these layers of politicization and conflict that shape this. So that makes it hard. Another piece, there's much we could say about this, but I think another piece is sometimes we move towards black and white thinking prematurely
Mhm.
and kind of superimpose a framework onto people who are wrestling with this complexity without actually being in relationship with people. So policies that have rolled out around gender dysphoria and gender identity in the United States and perhaps in Canada have sometimes made this
Mm.
mistake where we want to have doctrinal clarity so badly that in certain ways we actually are giving a framework that does not end up being very useful to the people who are actually navigating these spaces. The idea
Mhm.
of a sex binary is something many people with dysphoria believe and agree with. That doesn't answer the question of if I'm a natal male or can I grow my hair out long? Is that morally permissible? you know,
Right.
that kind of available to me, or what treatments are available? That really doesn't answer that question when we're talking about mental health concerns.
Absolutely. I mean, when I think about the things that you're saying and around accompaniment and how important that is, I mean, if we just really study the life of Christ and the way he had his ministry with people, I mean, he was associating with individuals that was seen as scandalous. And he navigated that in such a way that he would never have given. I mean, want to be careful with this, but I find it odd that he who is the holiest who ever lived, people were attracted to him, and yet those who weren't as holy but presented themselves as such, people were repelled by them.
Mm.
There's never been a better example of someone who had the idea of the sacredness of the other and would always bring proximity and relationship and accompaniment and presence. I mean, he didn't walk around Samaria as the Jews tended to do. He walked right into it, into the heart of a place where he knew shame and maybe some sinful past existed to bring his presence. I don't understand why we're scandalized or shocked by that, or how that can't inform our presence as church in these issues of sexuality and gender dysphoria and all the other stuff. To me, it's just another way of Jesus, who is now living mystically in his church, is to interact with the world. You know what I mean?
That's right. Yeah, I think people are afraid of the pendulum swinging too far. They're afraid of a lack of theological clarity. They're afraid of an inability to say things that are true in relationship with people. They're afraid of kind of being so concerned with being accepted and liked that they would lose sight of the deep, profound richness of our truths of our faith. And it's been my experience in walking with people across differences in this space, people who are politically all over the map, people who make different decisions than I would make for them in their lives, that it has not made my clarity about doctrine any less clear. It's
Right.
actually not so fragile. Our teachings are not fragile. They're not changed by the presence of a person who contradicts them in any kind of way. Not saying every person does, by the way. It's not so fragile. Our teachings are not fragile. And so that gives me freedom. It gives me flexibility to be with people. And Christopher West has a great line in one of his books. I'm blanking on which one actually in this moment, but he has this framework where he's reflecting on the adulterous woman that Jesus advocates for and protects in front of the religious leaders. And they are enacting the law, the just sentence for her crime. And Jesus protects her first. He doesn't say to her, "Hey, are you willing to stop doing X, Y, and Z? And then I'll come and I'll close the gap." No, he protects her life. He protects her dignity and does this public demonstration of her value as such in front of everybody who is framed, to your point, as the most religious among us. And then after that, he turns to her and at some point he says, "Go therefore and sin no more." And what's striking about this that Christopher West riffs on is that she doesn't turn to him and say, "Don't tell me what to do with my body or my life."
Right.
Why?
Yeah.
Why doesn't she do that? Well, perhaps because when he looks at her, she is looked at in a way that she's never been seen in her entire life. The love, the presence, the conviction of her dignity is something that she wants to follow.
Mhm.
That to me is the best of accompaniment. It's reflecting the person of Christ who loves perfectly to people and in our own imperfection that we also do imperfectly. But most people have very few examples of Christ-like love in their life. And so as Catholics, we can be that model where people are drawn to him and say, "I want to come and see. I want to follow you."
Yeah.
That, I think, is the best of evangelization today, and the best opportunity we have of bringing people with these experiences closer to the heart of Christ.
Amen. And certainly the dynamic of an individual relationship and being that presence of Christ to an individual, I would also say that there's a tremendous evangelical witness opportunity for families and family life, because people who are brought into families and they see the interaction, particularly the unique, manifestation of a particular individual being accepted in love as
Mm.
distinct from this other individual, and everybody being invited to thrive in their own way and their own personality, is tremendously therapeutic to those who carry this shame. And it's like, I have to be a particular way, to be accepted and all that. So I just, I've often been drawn back to the missionary dimension of family life and how important it is in this day. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yes. The family, right? Being the domestic church. The family is the place of sanctification for all of us, arguably by extension, and in the nitty gritty of daily life. And it is such a witness, and so many focuses on ministries and apostolates, which have their place and are so helpful, can sometimes even distract us from the primary domestic church, the family, where it's, as you said, kind of the cultivating ground for the dignity of persons and the reflection of the communion of persons in the Trinity, frankly. And what a gift that is so unique and so important.
Absolutely. I'm going to, I want to shift. I feel compelled to shift a little bit. Hopefully I'm not putting you on the spot, and feel free to not want to talk about this, but one of the things that I like to do when I have guests who have a platform is to give them an opportunity to speak into some areas that takes them maybe off of pedestal and kind of normalizes their experience. So I've got to think, Dr. Julia, with you so strongly being present in the intersection of spirituality, psychology, and in the tricky, messy areas of gender and same-sex attraction, all that, you would come across a lot that would be affirming, and you probably are coming across a lot of people that are like, "What are you doing?" How do you navigate that? Because that's hard. You're a person. You've got emotions. You got feelings. You don't want negative things or whatever. Like, have you had any of that experience? And how do you stay grounded? And how do you persevere in being a light in this area, which is so
Hmm.
political and charged? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, no one ever dislikes what I say. Um,
I'm
you
sure.
know yeah, as a person and maybe to my particularity as a particular person, I am by nature a people pleaser. I, like everybody else, want to be understood. I want to be thought well of. And, so arguably the hardest part about what I do is knowing again and again and bumping up again and again on the reality that there will be people who do not like the things that I say, who misunderstand what I say and misunderstand what I'm doing and frame me, especially in our faith communities, as kind of problematic, doctrinally in error. And I'm always open. The first thing I'll say is something that's been a discipline for me is when people are critical of me, really taking to prayer and to relationships with my spiritual director and my therapist and my friends, the things that are said about me, because I never want to be so in the ivory tower that I would argue that the person who's critical of me has nothing to teach me. In fact,
Right.
the people who are critical of me have helped me sharpen my ability to articulate what I do understand about this, what I would say about the faith. So it has been a teacher to me. And I think that's the first lesson I've taken from being misunderstood is let your critic be a teacher of
Mm.
you, and then be willing to disregard the things that are not true and not relevant. I mean, teasing apart the place of wisdom in what somebody's sharing. And if somebody's really just invested in seeing and making me out to be a caricature, then letting them, kind of relinquishing the control, not making it my ministry to convince somebody. And that's where I've had to surrender a lot. The place that has been most useful in this for me, which is really painful, but it has really helped me sustain this, is twofold. My mentor, Mark Yarhouse, told me once that if you speak to a room of people and everybody likes what you said, you lied about something. And so I've actually been struck by that again and again, that my job is not to make everybody in a room receive me. My job is to speak as accurately and honestly as I can, to clarify where I'm not, to repent of the ways that I'm unclear. And then at the end of my day, and this is the second piece of it, at the end of my day, I answer to Christ. When I put my head on the
Mm.
pillow, I have to make an examination of conscience to Him. And so trusting the work of the Holy Spirit in my spiritual life to help convict me in areas of error, to help me grow in confidence and courage in areas of strength, gifts that I have to offer the church, and just really continually surrender that desire to be understood by other people, some of whom will be invested in really misunderstanding me. And so slowly, I'm growing, I think, in that. And that's been really helpful for me personally, professionally, and spiritually, I think, as well.
Yeah, that's really good. And I'm sure listeners that have heard your wisdom, they can find situations to apply that to in their own life, because it's not just about gender, issues or same-sex attraction or any of those things that you're in. We live in such a world that, you know, it's almost like you don't give us time and space. The culture doesn't give us time and space to think things through, and so somebody, says something and they're brought to account 10 years later. It's like, where's the grace? Can we just all admit that we're evolving? I don't agree with half of what I said 10 years ago. We're evolving creatures. We develop understanding and all the rest of it. So it's not just your situation, although that's a very acute one. The wisdom, I think, can apply to anybody.
That's right. Assuming that people are on a journey. When I write books, I wish I could put a caveat at the front of everyone that this is how I'm thinking today. This is my current understanding based on what is
Yeah.
currently available. Something could come out 3 months from now that could shape this differently for me. And really appreciating that, in such complexity, I hope I get to the end of my life and think there are things I got right. And there's a lot that I just was not right on. And to be able to have a spirit of humility and about that, but also the grace you mentioned for one another as we're all trying
Yeah.
to do the best we can, we hope, in these spaces that are so
Yeah.
challenging and so charged.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Julia, what is on the horizon for you? Do you have another book in the go? Do you have other apostolic initiatives? What's on the horizon?
Yes. So the next book project will be released, I think, in October of this year, 2025. And that will be a book called Emerging Sexual Identities. So some listeners may be familiar with my work, Emerging Gender Identities. And this is a parallel text for people trying to accompany youth exploring sexual orientation categories that have so expanded in recent years. So it's the first half is a bit more engagement with queer theory and kind of the framework of sexual orientation and how it's evolved. The second half is all ministry applications. How do we do relationships effectively as Christians and engage with some of these spaces with young people today?
Yeah.
So that's a new book project. I've developed a Patreon recently where I'm trying to put out low-cost video content for people on a lot of things related to the intersection of faith, sexuality, and gender and psychology. So that's something. And then the final thing that I'm really excited about, Brett, is there's the 2-book series I've found is going to be probably most accessible to parents in video series form. So I'm trying to put together kind of a video module series for parents to help them get some of the crash course in some of these pieces of talks about sexuality, and to put out some worksheets and some video content that parents can just tap into, 10-minute clips that they can really receive a lot from. So I've been working on that, and I'm also hoping to translate that into Spanish at some point.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's great. So what about like right now, where do people find you? You got the YouTube channel. Where can they find you online?
Yeah, so they can follow me on Instagram. I have a mailing list through my website, which is easy enough, firstandlastname.com, juliasadusky.com. So that's a good way to keep in touch. And obviously the Patreon, the YouTube channel would be other good options, as well as following my work.
That's great. All right, Dr. Julia, I think we'll pause there. Thanks again so much for doing this twice. My error. This has been a rich conversation. I know it'll be a blessing, as will all of your writing, the YouTube channel, everything that you're doing. So listeners, please go online and check out the work of Dr. Julia Sadusky. You will not be disappointed. You'll be edified, encouraged, and well-formed to navigate this wonderful world in which we find ourselves. So Dr. Julia, thank you so much.
Yes, thanks, Brett.
Listeners, we'll see you next time.